Hey there, welcome to the Vue JS crash course. In this video, you will start from the absolute beginning and you will learn how to create your first web applications using one of the most popular JavaScript frameworks in the market today. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe to the web schools for more tutorials like this. So without further ado, let's jump right into the Vue JS crash course. Hi there, in the next few lessons you will learn some of the basic fundamentals of Vue JS. In order to do that, we are going to build together this pizza ordering Vue JS application. You can click this button to add a pizza to the basket. You can add other pizzas. Let's add a third pizza. And now we have the quantities. We can change the quantities using these buttons. And when we get to 1, if we click the minus button again, we're going to remove the pizza from the basket. We can also use these X icons on the right side to remove items from the basket. At the bottom of the list, we have the total of the order, and if we add more items or change quantities, the total is always going to be up to date. So these are the functionalities we are going to build together. Now let's go to the Vue.js documentation. You can just click install. Then let's go down here to this section without build tools, which means that we're just going to call that Vue.js script right from our HTML page. Here you have some instructions on how to get started. So let's do all this on the files of our project. So these are the initial files for this project. We're going to be using Visual Studio Code, so you can just right click anywhere on the folder, show more options. Then I have here this open with code, which if I click, I'll open this with Visual Studio Code. If you don't have that option, you can just go to File, Open Folder. It's right here. And then you can select the projects folder and you should have it open on your text editor. So here we have the basic structure of the HTML file. On your version, you should have all the HTML code for the app inside this pizza restaurant div. On my version, this is blank for now because I want to show you something without too much HTML distraction here. I will paste the content inside this div in a moment, so we start working with the same files. You will also find the Vue.js script we just copied and also the call for our JS and our CSS files. Now let's take a look at the CSS file. As you can see, all the code is already written. You don't have to write any CSS for this project. And we also have an empty JavaScript file. All right, so this is the basic structure of our project. In the next video, we're going to start writing our first lines of code using Vue.js. I'll see you then. To get started with our first Vue.js application, we're going to call the Vue object that's now available after we imported the Vue.js script. And we are going to call a method called createApp. We're going to pass an object here, but we don't have to fill it just now. Now we can define an HTML element inside of which our application will run. And for that, we are going to use the mount method. And now let's go back to the HTML code. Let's remember that we have this element with the ID of pizza restaurant. So here we are going to pass its CSS selector. And now our application will be running inside this element. Now to run the application, we could just open the HTML file in the browser, but I prefer to use the live server extension. If you don't have that, you can just go to the extensions section, install it, then restart Visual Studio Code, and then this option should be available to you as well. What this is going to do is opening the application in the web browser, and every time we update the code, it's going to update the browser automatically, without us having to refresh the page all the time. Now let's open the inspector to see what's going on. Let's go to the console. Everything seems normal here. We just have one warning, but this is going to go away soon. Now let's start adding some properties to this object. And the first one is going to be the data function. So we start a function and we are going to return an object that contains all the data properties of our application. So we can create a new property called message and assign a value to it. Now, if we go back to our application, remember it's running inside this HTML element. Let's use it as a variable in our template. And now if we go back to the browser, we can see that value showing on the page. If you go to the official Vue JS documentation, you will find this subject under template syntax. So we are using the template syntax, which is represented by the double curly braces, and inside it we can pass the data properties of our application, and their values will be rendered on the page. If you scroll down, there's also an important section about passing HTML code as data properties. There are specific situations in which we might want to do that. If that's the case, we can't use the template syntax. So let's say we were trying to pass this HTML code and we wanted this to render correctly on the page. But if we pass inside the template syntax, as you can see, the browser is not interpreting that HTML code. So in that case, we need to use the vHTML directive, and we use directives as attributes of the HTML element. And now by doing that, we can see that the HTML has been rendered correctly. Don't worry about this for now. We are gonna see this in more detail later. I just wanted to point out, because at some point, if you need to pass HTML content to the template, you need to have this in mind. Now let me copy and paste the complete HTML code for this project. You don't have to do that because your version already has it. So now I just pasted the code, and if we go back to the browser, this is what you should be seeing as well. So we have one hard-coded HTML for one item, and what we need to do here is start having our page dynamic. So instead of having this hard-coded HTML, we're going to get all the pizzas from the data properties of our Vue JS application. So going back to our JavaScript file, we had this data property that we used to test the application. Let's remove this and let's create one called menu. This is a new data property. Now let's paste the array for the list of items. You can find that piece of code right below this video in a code snippet. So I just added the array just like we had in the code snippet, and we can add more data properties. So let's add one called cart. So the first one is our list of items, and now we are also going to start a list of products that will be added to the basket. But that's not for now. The first thing we need to do is displaying all the items on our page. So let's remember that so far we have just one item hard-coded on the HTML. And now we're going to go through this list, and by using a loop, we're going to render all the items we have on the list. And this is the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Hello, in this video, we are going to loop through the array of items so we can display all of them on our page. Before we speak about structures of repetition, which we are going to need here to repeat this block of code for all of the items, first let's see if we can bring the information from the first item into this HTML block. Now we know we can use the template syntax to bring values from the data properties, so we could call the menu array and bring the first item like that. We're gonna do it in a moment to update the name and price, but here we have an extra challenge because we need to change this attribute. So we can just add the colon before the name of the attribute, and we'll let Vue.js know we are going to enter a data property. We can just bring the menu data property here, but since we need to concatenate strings and a dynamic value, let's use template literals from JavaScript using the backticks. And inside here, we are going to write a piece of string that will repeat for all of the images. And with the $sign and the curly braces, we can pass something dynamic. In this case, this is going to be the path of the image. We have that in the image property. So we are just going to bring in the menu object, the first item, and the image property. Let's do the same thing for the alt text. Let's get the name of the item instead, which is in the name property. Now for the name and price, we can just use the template syntax. So we need to bring the name and the price. These two are very simple to do. Let's save this. And if we go back to the browser, we can see that we now have the information, but now it is dynamic. If we go back to the data properties and we change, let's say, the price, we save this, and as you can see, the price is up to date on the browser. Now we need to do a loop, so we repeat this structure for all the items in our list, and this is the subject for the next video. I'll see you then. Hi there, in this video we're going to do the structure of repetition for our list of items. We are going to use a loop for that. In the official Vue JS documentation, you can find the loops under list rendering. We can use the v-for directive, which is very useful to loop through arrays and objects. So let's see how this works. We have one data property called items, which is an array, and every element of this array is an object. This is exactly the same structure we have for our menu object. So when we open the top element of that code block, we're going to use the v-for directive as an attribute of this element, and this is really simple to do. We can just assign like a variable name that will be assigned to each of the items while we iterate over that list. And we use the in keyword and the name of the array we want to loop through. If you scroll down on this page, you will see other examples of using the v-for. You can see how you do it with an object. Let's remember we have an array of objects, so that's the example we see on the top of the page. But if you want to iterate over an object, here's how you do it. You can also do the v-for with a range if you want to repeat a piece of code, let's say 10 times. And for now, that's all we needed to know. So let's go back to the code and try to implement this loop. So let's start the v-for directive. Then we're going to assign like a name for each of the items. So let's call it item. And then let's use the in keyword and let's iterate over the menu. Now, just one thing I will do and explain in a moment, we should always add an index, meaning that the first name we choose is going to be the name of the item while we iterate, and the index is going to be the index of each of these elements. Now, to complete this work, we need to add the key attribute, and we're going to assign the index as the key. We're going to go back to this subject in a moment so you understand in more detail what we just did here. Okay, now that we set up the for loop, we're going to repeat this block of code for all the items in the list. So let's replace the hard-coded menu 0 that we were getting for the first item, and let's use the item instead. So at every iteration, the item is going to be assigned to each of the elements in that list. If we save this and go back there, now we can see all the elements being rendered correctly. So we are getting them dynamically from that list. And since we are repeating the exact same structure and all the classes, we can see that the hover effects and animations are working for all of them. Pretty cool. Now we need to start working in the add to basket functionality. But before we do that, let's go back to the documentation so we understand better why we used the index and the key attribute. So here we are in the list rendering section, and the example we have for the v-for is much simpler. We just have v-for item in items, and then we use the declarative rendering. We don't have the index, and we don't have the key attribute. But if you scroll down all the way to where it says maintaining state with key, you will see one example with the key attribute. Now going down here, you can see it says it is recommended to provide a key attribute with v-for whenever possible, unless the iterated DOM content is simple, or you are intentionally relying on the default behavior for performance gains. So what this is telling us is that by using the key attribute, our loop will perform better. So from now on, as a best practice, every time we use a v-for loop, let's use the key attribute. We could have used a property for each of the objects. So in this example, we can see the key being attributed to the name of each of them. But what I normally see is this pattern of listing the index of each of the items and using the indexes as the key. Alright, so now we are ready to start working in the add to basket functionality. And this is the subject of the next video. I'll see you then. Bye-bye. Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to start working in the add to basket functionality. Now that we have all the pizzas coming from our data properties and they all have their own prices, we should be able to add them to the basket. If you look on the right hand side, we just have an empty basket with a total of 0. So this is what we're going to work on in this video. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go back to our data properties, and to test the basket, let's just copy one item and let's paste it in this property called cart. So this is how this is going to work. Every time we click on an item, we're going to add it to the cart property. And here we're going to use a loop again, just like we did for rendering all the pizzas above. So let's scroll down to the order items element. But before we start with the loop here, there's something important that we need to do, because if you notice, we have the order items element and we have the cart empty element. And these elements should never be showing at the same time, because either we have elements in the basket or we have the empty basket. So how do we solve this? Well, in the old days of JavaScript and jQuery, we would have to write a lot of lines of code just to control when we show, when we hide these elements. But with Vue JS, this is actually much simpler. Let's go to the documentation, so I'll show you a very important directive. So let's go to the conditional rendering section. As you can see, we have vif, velse, and velse-if directives. And it's very easy to guess what these directives do. We're gonna use it as an attribute, just like we did with the v4 directive. And if we pass something that is true, then this element is going to show. If we pass something that is false, then this element is not going to show. So if we scroll down, there's a complete example where we can have multiple conditions. So let's say we have a data property called type. So if we have A as the type, then we're going to show this element. Else, if the type is B, we're going to show this element. Else, if the type is C, this is the element that will show. If not any of the above, then we are going to show this element. So this is how it works. So it's super simple. So we can write our clean HTML, and Vue JS is going to take care of deciding which element to show. In our case, if we have items in that cart array, then we're going to show the list of items. If not, we're going to show that element that says that the cart is empty. Just before we move on, let me just show you a few more things here. We haven't spoken about the template element yet, but basically this is an invisible wrapper. So let's say instead of just showing one element, we have more elements that we want to show at the same time. For this, we could create a div, but then we would have an extra div in our code. If we use the template, if this condition is true, we're just going to show what's inside. We're not going to have any further element. So this is just an invisible wrapper. Another thing that's important to mention is that we also have a vShow directive. And the way it works is very similar, but vShow won't work with velse and velse-if. So it's more when you have one condition, and the difference here is that if you have a vif that has a false statement, that element is not going to be part of the DOM. It's not going to be in the HTML at all. If you have a condition that is true, then that element is going to be inserted at the DOM. With the vShow, it's a bit different. The element is always going to be in the DOM, but if you have a false statement here, it's just going to be hidden, but it is going to be in the DOM. If you go to the inspector, you will be able to see that element. So when to use vif and when to use vShow for these simple examples. There's an explanation here that says that the vif has better performance when you first load the page, because If Vue JS doesn't have to show that element is not going to exist. But with the vShow, that element is going to be inserted on the page anyway. So it's going to have a higher cost on performance. However, if you have elements that you need to toggle a lot, then the vShow is going to perform better because all the elements are going to be on the page already since the beginning. So toggling between them is just going to be faster. With the Vue, toggling is going to cost a bit more because you're going to have to be adding and removing elements from the DOM. So having said that, what we need for our case is the Vue-if and the Vue-else directives. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code so we can write our statements. So what condition are we going to test? Well, if the cart array has any element, its length is going to be higher than 1. So we can just write Vue-if, and then we can write our condition, which is going to be cart.length is higher than 0. Then, if not, so Vue-else, then we're going to show the empty element. Before I save this, let's go back to the browser and let's just see what we had before. So let's find this element. So as you can see, we have the order items and we also have the cart empty element. So obviously that's not what we want to do. We want to show either one or the other. And the Vue-if is going to do that for ourselves. Let's go back there and save it. And now if we go back here, we can see that now we only have the order items element. Of course, there's nothing inside it because we didn't write any HTML yet. But the reason why we're seeing it is because remember that we added an item to the cart array. Now let's go back and remove it and let's see if there is any difference. So let's just comment this item and leave this array empty again. And now if we go back there, the only element we're seeing is the cart empty one. So we are ready to start writing the HTML for the order items. So let's uncomment this item so we can see the element again. Now we can see that it's showing on the page. And now we can start writing the HTML for the items. And this is the subject for the next video. I'll see you then. Hello, in the previous video we used the Vue-if and Vue-else directives to decide if we're going to show the order items element or the cart empty element. And we did that by testing if the length of the cart array is greater than 0. So now let's start writing the HTML for each of the items that are added to the basket. Remember that we're going to have to use a loop here as well because we can add multiple items to the basket, but let's start with each individual element. So let's add a div, let's add a class of order item, then let's just add this bootstrap class mb4, that's for the margin bottom, and here we're going to add the v4 loop. So this is going to be item and an index like we did before, but this time the array is going to be the cart. Let's also add the key, just like we did in the previous example, and now we have the loop done. Now I need to apologize because we're going to have to write some HTML for the item. I don't like doing this during the course. I did my best so we could only focus on the view part, but for the item, I didn't have it ready in the initial template. So we're going to have to write the HTML for the item. Just follow along with me and write the same elements and classes. If you don't want to write everything by yourself, right below this video, I left a code snippet for the whole HTML of the item. You can just copy and paste and replace the dynamic parts. So let's start with the image of the product. Let's add a class of order item image and a source, which is going to be a dynamic one. Again, let's use the backticks to add /images/ and then the dynamic part is going to be the image of that item. Let's also do the same thing for the alt tag. So this is just the basic HTML of it. And now we can add another div with a class of order item content, which is going to have an age 5 for the name of it. Then let's add a dash. Let's add the price. So I just added the $sign before and now the price. And let's use the toFix method so we can round it to 2 decimal places. Let's also add a p element, and inside it we can add a button for the plus and a button for the minus icons, so we can increase or decrease the quantities. So one is going to have a class of add. Let's just add the type of button. The other one is also going to be a button, and the class is going to be remove. Now finally, let's add another div for the order item details. Here we can add a span. Let's have a strong element here for the amount of calories, since we have that information. So item.calories. Let's do the same thing for the other information. And at the end of it, let's also add a button with a class of remove icon. And that's going to be that X button that we can also use to remove each of the items. If we go back there, we can see that now we have the whole HTML structure. I'm sorry that we had to write all the HTML like this, but I already have all the CSS ready, so it's just a matter of you copying exactly the same elements as I did, and you should be seeing the same thing. Now let's remove that item from the cart. Now you can see that the basket is empty, so this is working exactly as expected. Alright, so now we know that when we have items in the basket, they are going to show correctly. Now we need to work on the actual functionality of adding and removing them, and that's the subject for the next video. I'll see you then. Hey, in this video, we're going to build the functionality to add and remove items from the basket. In order to do that, we need to speak about methods. So let's go back to the documentation real quick. Let's go to Reactivity Fundamentals, and then we can scroll down to the Declaring Methods section. As you can see, this is going to be at the same level of the data properties. So we started our application. We declare the data properties for the pizzas and then for the cart. And then when we close that object, we can open another one for the methods. So if we want to add some item to that cart array, we need a method to do that. Before we go ahead, just one important thing is that I know modern JavaScript uses a lot of arrow functions, but this is not a good practice for methods because we won't have access to the this keyword. And as you see in a moment, we're gonna have to use the this keyword a lot if we want to interact with our data properties. So don't use arrow functions for the methods. Let's just use the good old function syntax. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go up to see where we started the data properties. We can collapse this whole section so it's easier to see. So now we're going to create a new object for the methods. And inside here, we're going to create our methods. So let's create a new one called add pizza. So we're going to use this method for every time we click these buttons. Since this is going to be the same method for all pizzas, the way we're going to differentiate them is through an ID. So let's pass an ID as an argument of that function, and this way we know which pizza we want to add to the basket. Now let's start with a constant called pizza. And then we need to get that ID and find it on the menu array. So let's use this.menu.find. This is just a simple JavaScript method. So we are going to find a pizza that has the same ID as the one we are passing in this method. And then we are going to have it stored in the pizza constant. Now let's send it to the console just so we can see what we have so far. And now, of course, we need to tell Vue JS when to execute this method. So let's go back to the documentation again. And now what we need to look for here is the event handling, because after all, we want to execute this method when we click on that button. So how do we handle this in Vue JS? We can see that is through the von directive. We can write it like this. So von column and then the name of the event, which is click, or we can use the shortcut, which is @click. Let's go down here so we can see an example. So in that button that we have to add the pizza to the cart, that red button, we can just add the directive directly as an attribute, and then we can call the name of the method that we want to execute on click. So let's go back there and do that. Let's go back to the HTML and find that button. So here it is, the add to cart button. And now we are going to use the shortcut. So @click. And then we're going to add the name of the method, which is add pizza. Let's remember we need to pass the ID. And since we are inside the loop, we have access to the ID of the item. So let's go to the console and click it. And as you can see, when we click that button, we are sending to the console all the information about that pizza. So basically, we're getting that whole object for that item, and now we can do anything we want with it. And what we are going to do is actually adding to that cart array. Before we do that, I forgot one thing in the HTML, which is the quantity. So let's find the plus and minus buttons, which are right here. And between these two buttons, let's just show the quantity. But if you look at the original object for the pizzas, you see that there is no quantity property. So we're gonna have to do something first. Let's start with checking if this pizza has been already added before. So let's create a constant called index. Let's write this.cart.findIndex. And then we can check if that ID is present in the cart. If it is, it's going to return the index of it. If not, it's going to return -1. This is just a basic JavaScript method. Now we're going to start an if statement, and if that pizza is not there, the index is going to be -1. So if it's not -1, it means that it is there. Else, it means that the pizza is not there. So what we're going to do is this.cart.push, and now we can push the pizza, but let's use the spread syntax. So we bring just the properties of it, and then we can add another property to this object, which is going to be the quantity. So the first time the quantity is going to come as 1. Of course, we could have done that in 2 lines of code, adding the pizza first and then adding a new property called quantity, but I think using the spread operator to bring just the properties of the object makes the code cleaner. If you have any doubts about what we just did, you can search on Google for JavaScript spread syntax. Now let's handle the other scenario when the pizza is already on bag. So in this case, we're just going to increase the quantity by 1. So we're going to find it by the index, and we're going to use the incremental operator. So let's go back there and test. The first time we click the button, the pizza is added, and the next times is just going to increase the quantity. And we can do the same thing for the other ones. Alright, so now we are almost done with this project. We just need to create the functionality to remove items from the basket and also to calculate the total price. I'll see you in the next video so we can continue. Hi there, in this video we're going to build the total payment functionality. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and let's create a method to do the calculation. Let's call it getTotalPrice. And here we just need to create a new variable for the total, which is going to start at 0. And then we're going to check the items that we have in the cart and just loop through them and sum their totals. So this dot cart dot for each, it's just a basic JavaScript loop. Then we're going to create an item for each iteration of the loop, which is going to be the item in the basket with all those properties. And then we're just going to add to the total variable the price of this item times its quantity. So as simple as that. And since this is a method, let's return the total rounded to 2 decimal places. All right, so now that we have this method, we can just go back to the HTML. Let's get to where we have the total. Here it is. Now we just need to replace the hard-coded 0 by that method. That's it. Now going back to the page, we can see that the total starts at 0. And when we add the first pizza, we can see that now the total is being updated. We can add more, we can change quantities, and everything is going to be up to date automatically. So this is why we call Vue JS reactive. We didn't have to set on change events for anything. We just call that method, and every time there's a change in the cart, Vue JS is going to recalculate everything automatically. Okay, so now let's start building the functionalities to reduce and increase the quantities that we have in the cart. Let's start by the reduce item one. So here we are going to pass the ID of that item so we can find it in the cart. Let's create a variable for the item, which is going to be this.cart.find. So we are going to use the find function from JavaScript. And by using the ID that we have as an argument, we are going to find that item in the cart. And now we just need to decrease its quantity. So let's do item.quantity. Let's use the decremental operator minus minus. Now going back to the HTML, let's find that minus button. Here it is. And we're going to add a click event. And when that happens, we're going to call the reduce item method. Let's not forget the item ID so we can get the correct item in the cart. Now there's just one thing we need to adjust here, but let's go back to the page to see how this is working now. Let's add a pizza, maybe 5 times. So now we have 5. Let's start decreasing the quantity to see what happens. So 3, 2, 1, then we get to 0, minus 1, minus 2, and of course that's not what we want. We're gonna need to check the quantity before decreasing it. So let's erase this for now. Let's just start an if statement. And if the quantity is greater than 1, so item.quantity greater than 1, then we're going to do what we were doing. But if not, we're just going to remove this item from the basket. So we can just do this dot cart. And by using the filter function from JavaScript, we can easily remove this item from the cart. So we can just do this dot cart dot filter. So we're going to leave only the items that don't have this current ID, which means that we're just going to remove this specific item. Now it should be working fine. Let's test this out. Let's add it 6 times, reduce the quantity. When we get to 1, we can remove the pizza from the basket. Same thing for any other pizzas that we try. Okay, so now let's start creating the method for increasing the quantity, which is going to be very similar. So add item and let's pass the ID. Now let's create a variable for the item. So it's going to be this.cart.find. So same thing we had above by using the find function. And now it's going to be even simpler because we can just increase the quantity. We don't have to check for anything because we can add as many pizzas as we want. Let's not forget to add the click event. And every time it happens, let's just call the add item method. So now let's add the pizza multiple times. We can decrease the quantity and we can also increase the quantity. Now the only thing missing is the functionality for that X button to remove items. So let's do that now. So let's create a method called remove item. Let's pass an ID. And let's just do the same thing we did above, this.cart. And then we're just going to filter and leave everything but the item that has this specific ID. Now let's not forget to add this method to the HTML. So here is the X icon. Let's add a click event. When it happens, let's call the remove item method. Let's test this out. So we have a pizza in the cart. We can increase and decrease quantity. And if we click the X button, we can remove it from the basket. We can add more and we can remove all of them. When we remove all the pizzas, we have the empty cart message, which is pretty cool. So that was pretty much it for this first project. I hope you liked it. If you have any questions or you want to add your feedback, you can use the Q&A section. So that was all for today. I hope you found this video useful. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the Web Schools.